we are a family, and how many are going to live together forever? Seriously, you're going to be living together forever, okay? If you're not sure yet, we can work on that today to make sure that your eternal insurance is covered and that we'll be together forever. But it's an honor to be here, honestly. It's a joy. I love these men and their brides and all the people that have helped make the Rock what it's been all these years. You know, it's wonderful to be in a season on earth where things are not changing that aggressively and everything's just kind of going smoothly. And it's just the way it's been for a long time now. And I'm just basking in the simplicity of life and no complexity, no challenges. How about you guys? Anyway, so, you know, when you're kind of looking back at history, which is his story in our lives, it's filled with ups and downs. I mean, if you were to chart out your life or the Rock of Roseville, it wouldn't be this plain, it wouldn't be a flat plateau, it would be probably a mountain range, you know. Hopefully your mountain, your heights are higher than your lows, but, you know, looking back at my life, there was some major highs and lows. And so the Rock really has been a place where we've gone through lots of exciting adventures, but also many challenges as well. And so we came down from a church called Glad Tidings in Yuba City, a church that I got saved in back in the revival, and wound up migrating to Yuba City. And then 20 years ago, Susie, my beautiful wife in the first row, who I love magnificently, yes, she is here looking gorgeous, came down with Deborah and Havila, who were 19 at the time. Susie just got back yesterday from celebrating their 40th birthday in New York City. Havila was speaking there, and so it's amazing to see your kids turn 40. But when we first saw the building, Ken and Lydia Burks, who were here last night, have been the pastors of that facility in Bonita, which is a block or so away. And it was a very wet winter like our winter, but for some reason, the street flooded, and they had bags of sand outside the building. And inside, there was actually one room, it had been closed down for a while, that had 10,000 bees in a giant pile. And I know because I counted. And it was just wild to see. Walk in this building, this is our future, what's going to happen? And so that was 10 amazing years. I call it the old normal, because that's really what life was about. There was no internet, no entertainment on demand. There were only a few options in life, less distractions, pre-recession, smaller church. People got to know each other in a more intimate way. And one of our initial mantras, when Susie and I traveled, we saw some very healthy churches, some not so healthy, but we incorporated into our Rock values a general statement: everybody loves, gives, serves, and honors. And that really became something we were endeavoring to do and still endeavoring to do. We want to learn how to love everyone, to give as God asks us to serve as servants of God, and also to honor one another. So that's still a part of our DNA. But over the years, it's morphed. It's gone through some changes. With a smaller church, it was much more easy for that to happen. And so we sent out a couple of churches back then, about 250 people combined. And we sent out in our first church, a real faith venture, because my statement at that point was everyone can go except Susie. I was pretty selfish at that time, and so I felt like our relationship should be retained as a pastor. And so Susie's a keeper, and so she stayed, but 250 people took me up on it and went out and planted 2 churches. But in the first church, we sent out 40% of our income. Now imagine the faith venture in saying we are going to sow our best and be happy about that. And yet God, at that point, pre-recession, we were able to print money. And it was really an incredible time being able just to, whatever brand of bill you wanted, just be able to print it. It was tremendous. But the Lord was very faithful in honoring that. The next year, after we sowed that, we had about an 8% increase from the previous year. So he had made that up and then some. But it was a challenge, and I call that Rock 101. And Brandon and Bob are going to share their view of Rock 101.
Hey, we thought it would be fun this morning to do like an interview style to tell the story of the Rock. How many think it's important to celebrate what God's done over the years? So I know a lot of us weren't here for that founding season, 1997, those first 10 years. I was 3 years old when the Rock was founded, so hopefully that doesn't age anyone too much in the room. But for those of us who weren't there, Pastor Bob, Pastor Brandon, what was your experience walking into the Rock in that first season there?
So at that time, we were at another church as a family, and this girl was radically converted in my high school. She was an atheist, Gothic, wore makeup the whole 9 yards. And one day she comes to our economics class and comes in and starts preaching to me. And I'm like, no, you don't need to preach to me. I'm a Christian. She said, no, you're not a Christian. You don't live like a Christian. So she said, you need to come to my church. So we went and visited this youth group, and there was such an atmosphere of expectancy. You felt that God was going to show up. I looked around and saw all these people and friendly faces, met Pastor Francis in the lobby. I knew there was something different there, and I looked around. I was like, how long has this church been here? And there's these giant banners hanging up in the sanctuary. It says 2 years, celebrating 2 years. So we saw this church, and we could not believe what God was doing. We saw our first miracles when we were at the Rock. I remember getting this idea that people could hear the voice of the Lord and speak and prophesy. I had no concept for what miracles could look like in modern day. I always knew they happened in the book of Acts and the Gospels, but didn't know what it was like to live them out. So we started attending the youth group. We visited one Friday. The following Friday, we show up, and no one's at the building. So my brother and I are looking around, and we're trying to find people. And out walks Pastor Francis. He was editing a video. It was about 7 p.m. at night. And he says, did you guys know that youth group's over in Newcastle tonight? So I was like, okay, no problem. We'll just go ahead and drive home. He said, you know what? I'll drive you there. So he hops in his car. We follow him from Roseville to Newcastle. He drives us into the butler's house at the time, our friend Clayton's house. And as we were there, he walks us in, introduces us to people, gets us drinks, gets us food, makes sure we're situated, and we knew it was the place we needed to be. So God did an amazing time there, just getting us connected and expecting God to move.
Awesome. Pastor Bob.
Yeah, for me, I had been pastoring up in Washington for 13 years, planted a church. It grew, almost killed me. It grew that much. It was a blessing and the other thing. And, but it was hard. And we planted some churches, and, it was just, I've known Francis for 30 years now. He is a friend. He's a brother / kind of a father figure, not quite old enough there, but, just really respect him. And the thing I've known about him over the years, and you really know a man when you golf with him. And I've never seen him throw a club. He can't say that about me. So I've known him for 30 years, and the threads that are congruent in 30 years that I've been a part of is the integrity spiritually. He's an integral man, and also the passion. I would have him speak. He's the only guy that I would give carte blanche to speak in my church and do whatever he felt the Lord was telling him to do because I trusted him that much. And so I saw the life of God on him and flowing out of him, and we talked. And then when we planted the church, I would torment him. I called him about 7 or 8 months after he had planted the church, and it was going. And back when they had answering machines, remember those? And so the answering machine went off, and I went, yeah, this is Joe Jackson, and I've got 15 to 20 people. We're really committed, and we're looking for a church, and we heard about your church, and we want to bring all our tithes and offerings with us, and if you could please give us a call back, and I would find out later that he bid on it. He was like, oh, Susie, listen, there's all these people coming, and then after that, I'd leave a pause, and I'd go, Francis, this is Bob. So anyways, he had me come speak in the first year of the Rock, and I was just absolutely amazed at, the spiritual vitality, the worship, everybody had name tags, people were connected, and then there was fellowship afterwards. And so for me, coming from a drier season, of a long labor of love in my church and growth and all the good things, it was really refreshing when God sovereignly brought us down here, and that was 11 and a half years ago. And so to me, it's the life and the spiritual vitality and the integrity that for me has just been magnetic to the souls of my family and myself.
Come on. So after the first 10 years, 2007, the Lord gives us an opportunity to have a building at the gates of the city. Can you tell us about that season, Pastor
Yeah,
Francis?
Bonita was marvelous in terms of God's Spirit, but, I'm a guy who likes excellence, and I would go to the men's room and just really feel depressed. And so it was just an arcane kind of facility. Even though we spruced it up, we did the best we could. But I just wanted, I had traveled a lot, seen a lot, and I was hoping, to have a different type of facility to reach more people. We had maxed it out with 3 services, a small auditorium, small balcony, that kind of thing. And so coming here was a great joy. It was a labor of love, a big step of faith. But ironically, in 2007, the recession hit. How many of you guys heard about the recession? Seriously, did you ever hear about that? Anyway, and so when it hit with a vengeance, and it was brutal. It wasn't small. I remember one particular dear friend who was making $40,000 a month, who started to make nothing. I mean, literally, he went from that to nothing. And so it affected the church in a significant way. Ironically, I had written the year before we left Bonita, a book called Perfectly Positioned, about my own processing of the victorious life through lots of ups and downs. You know, I have had lots of challenges in my own personal life, which I wanted to be able to help other people in getting the victory that God had been working in me. So I began to share that. The very first series, Coming to the New Building, as the recession was now on, I shared that, and I expected everyone just to kind of, now that we've heard the message, let's all suck it up and have great attitudes. And yet people had lost houses, lost jobs, lost careers. I mean, and it's not a message that you can hear at once and adopt it. You can't pull on leaves to make them grow. This is something that has to be processed. Some of the revelations took me 6 months or 5 years to process and begin to really implement in my life as a filter. And so it was a challenge, and yet that life message has continued. I did it recently here, called The Secret to Loving Your Life. And so even at that point, looking around at the services, we had gone from 800 people coming in here. More people started coming. We had a 4th service, a 5th service, then a 6th service. And even though we didn't want it to happen and we tried to stop it, when you take a certain substance that may have a certain temperature and you add brand new people and divide them up over 6 services, the temperature fluctuates. And we couldn't contain it. The recession hit. So we were kind of being slapped around with all that. So there's less connectivity. Even though I knew the reality of connection, I didn't have the level of revelation we're going to talk about today that another generation would bring to the table. And so we tried. We had many runs up the mountain, connection, and yet I don't think it ever really hit in the way I would like to have seen it by any means. So as the finances dropped, we had 2/3 of our staff over time were let go. Income dropped by 1/3 to 1/2. And it's a big deal. It's navigating it. I didn't navigate it seamlessly. How many of you have felt like you've navigated your whole life seamlessly? It's amazing. We should make a movie about your life. So, I mean, all of us, we go through the changes, and how we respond to our decision-making, lack thereof, choices we make, whatever, is really, at the end of the day, when you lie on your deathbed, it's going to really be, what kind of heart do you have with all the body slams of life? It's not going to be, check, great, I hit this home run. No. How have you responded to life? I want to pause right here, because this is a big moment here. Did you get what life was about? Which means I'm going to trust the Lord that all that I went through was meant for my good to make me the person I'm called to be. And I'm not going to spend my life dying in regret or looking at what I wasn't. I'm going to embrace who I was and what God did. That's enough for that message. But it is a life message that I feel is very important to understand. But just to give a glimpse, as the world has changed, the first 10 years went fast. But man, it seemed like the last 10 years were like a year. They went so fast. And one example of how the world has changed, again, now obviously social media, internet, all those things, but the latest I heard was just kind of gave me a glimpse of the future. Amazon in December of last year submitted a patent for a blimp, a giant warehouse 45,000 feet in the sky, in which they're going to send drones down with your packages. And they've asked to be able to look at high structure buildings to recharge. And so they're looking to churches potentially to come and get power. Come on, somebody. Thank you so much. So I thought that metaphor works for me. I'm just thinking. But, and then Walmart followed in August, and they're going to have theirs at about 1,000 feet. That's the world we're about heading into, a different planet. And that's the end of Rock 2.0. Brandon.
Yes, so the world's changing, culture's changing, the church is changing. We're in about 2010 now. So, Pastor Brandon, what starts to happen in the youth world?
So about 2003, we started working in the youth ministry here as we send out churches. I remember being in the back room with my friend Nate and my friend Clayton, and we kind of drew straws of who would get what church. And at that time, the straw fell on the Rock of Roseville. And again, we did not know what was going to happen with the Rock, but again, the Lord showed up. In 2003, we actually had a small awakening. There was a revival happening in the church. So that was the era of youth ministry we stepped into, where there's an expectation. That youth ministry era was games and giveaways at a lot of churches you'd go to. And I went to Francis and the team. I said, listen, we're not going to be the games youth ministry. We got to see the encounter of the Holy Spirit at our churches here. So as we continue to pray and believe, we come into this new facility and we lost our culture. It was just one of those times we had all these students coming in. They're like, where's the games? When's your iPad giveaway? I'm thinking to myself, we have lost what church is about. And as we're here and we're praying, and Rachel and I entered the most difficult season of youth ministry. Right about that time, there was another church sent out of here. So 23 of our youth leaders transitioned with that church. So I remember it was Rachel, myself, and my brother at that time as these youth leaders. And we were just contending, said, Lord, if you don't show up, it's time for us to transition to do something else. And it was that year in 2010 that we had this winter camp we've referenced many times where the Holy Spirit showed up in such a magnificent way. It wrecked all of our lives for the good. And we saw these leaders start to emerge. It was from that time, again, of difficulty, we recognized the need in a shifting culture. That was really the heart of millennials coming to age. And as we were there, we recognized this need for community and mission. So we started these community groups, these theology groups. And I remember one night, I announced to the youth group, I said, hey, listen, we're going to do theology next Tuesday. We need to study the Bible. So again, just know we're not coming for fun. We're going to study the Bible. 70 kids show up to my house to study the Bible and just learn about it. So we were in something different. And as we started to pray around our community here at the Rock, we recognized that the poorest community in our whole county really is down the street. And as we were walking through there, we recognized the need of the households was practically they needed groceries. They did not have the funds to do so. What we learned was many of the families with drug addictions, they would have their government assistance taken from them or stolen, or they would sell it for drug money. So we had these kids that had no supplies for their family, and they really were left to fend for themselves. So we went to the elder board at the time and said, hey, there's a huge need down the street. We need money for groceries. And they said, honestly, we're laying staff off. We're trying to figure out how to keep our head above water. There's really no money in the budget right now. We're just trying to keep the lights on. So we were praying and said, Lord, you need to show us a way. And that night, we ended up watching a show called Extreme Couponing. And we saw this show, and we said, we can do that. So that next Friday night, we announced at the youth ministry, everybody bring your Sunday newspaper. We're going to cut out coupons, and we're going to buy groceries for the whole neighborhood. So we brought them in. There was 40 newspapers that showed up. That next Tuesday, we bought 150 boxes of cereal. And that year, we gave away about $20,000 of groceries for $5,000. It was just this amazing movement. Come on. So we saw there was something happening, that mission was important. And it really just birthed this season of what we called living the mission as a church.
Yeah, so Pastor Bob, can you talk about that a little bit? Because it's around 2011, 2012, where we really see the need for mission as a whole church body.
Yeah, I had observed in, however many years of full-time ministry, what churches do with people. And they spend a lot of time attracting them in, getting them in the doors. How can we grow the church? And then it just seems that a lot of times they'll put them through a cycle of programs and Bible studies and all good things, but it'll be insular. It'll be inside. And then what'll happen is at the time where I think people should be living their faith out, they'll go back in the circle again. And so you would hear things in churches. I'd speak somewhere. I'd ask people, give me, how would you describe your spiritual life? Just give me one word. I would say about 75% would say bored. And I thought, wow, I don't think Jesus intended the body of Christ to be bored, not with a living God. And so, I started to think about, what does it mean to take what we have and what we learn and how we grow and the spiritual passion and integrity, et cetera, out there. And so, got this idea just called Living the Mission. And Pastor John Houghton and I put together 5 or 6 DVDs. And it was basically taking the person who is terrified to share their faith and be salt and light. And a lot of easy ways, doable ways to do that. And so we did these. And, Bud Browning's community group, they went through it. And they said, you know what, we just can't wait for the church to do everything. We're going to do something. Now, that's a great idea right there. We're not going to wait for the church to do something. We're going to do something. Yeah, that's what Christians do. And so they started the food pantry. They started, the community store. They started ministering out. And you know what? You see the life start to happen in people's lives because that's how we're created to live. And so that has spawned into a further out dimension where, like Pastor Mark said, we've been to 13 countries this year. 13 countries, that includes Texas. Texas is a country. If you don't believe me, drive through it, okay? It's a country. So 13 countries, and we have a rhythm that we believe that we'll get to the point in the next 2 or 3 years where every month the Rock is going to another country with people that want to make a difference in the world, discipling, crisis response, loving on missionaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our short-term goal for 3 years is to build one church, 6 houses in Haiti, and to send 12 full-time missionaries from this church that will be in other countries, 3 of which watched live online from China last night, Gunnar, Preston, and Emily. So that's the track we're on. The mission is big.
Amazing. So the Lord plants the seeds of discipleship, plants the seeds of mission. Pastor Francis, tell us about what you call the Rock 3.0, the last few years.
So after being in this building for a few years, and I was involved in a pastoral luncheon with pastors initially in Roseville that spread around Sacramento, and all of a sudden we literally have hundreds of pastors who are coming to luncheons quarterly. Relationships are forming. Sacramento is a very multiracial, very diverse area, but we were building bridges across denominations, age groups, geography, ethnicity, and all of a sudden I find myself a leader within that as an older guy, but with a grace on my life to network. And so even yesterday, for example, I'm part of an MLK, Martin Luther King committee for many years now, and so I was filming people who receive awards in January, filming them as I've done for many years now, interviewing them about the awards they're going to receive. Incredible people in our community. So all of a sudden, though, I found myself functioning more regionally. Luis Palau came at that time, did a great festival, 40,000 people. And so Pastor Bob, again, we are dear friends, good friends. He initially, of course, had left being a senior pastor, but I was able to encourage him that if he became my co-senior pastor, that he would, his prayer life for me would increase, because he'll never want me to die. He would always want, he would never want to be the senior pastor again. But I needed him to come on as a co-senior pastor so I could really spend my time with my twins. I am a twin, I have twins, with the Rock and the Region, which prophetically God showed me, those are my twins, the Rock and the Region, which we have done, I think, very well. But over time, I also recognized that I did not have the Rock next. And being a father who wants to do best for his kids, which the Rock is my child, if you will, I knew that if God was not giving me the next, some other one would have that. And so gradually I saw in Brandon and others, they began to rise up, a different generation, different DNA, different perspective, but I recognized anointing again. The revival hit 2010. It was affecting our young people. As they got older, they hung around, they became leaders, the youth became leaders. I said, wow, this is like the movement we got saved in. We got saved in a move of God, and those young people became the leaders of another wave. I can cry right now if it helps. But it really, I mean, it gets me emotional because it reminded me of us, of a day when another generation, and I'm trying not to cry right now, and we recognized there was a handful, Susan and I reflect on this often, a handful of older people who welcomed us. Didn't judge us, didn't say clean up or else. They loved us, and they enabled us to grow in an environment that was affirming and encouraging. So that was what we wanted to do in our hearts. And so we saw a relational connection that in a small church and in the initial revival, when we lived communally for 7 years, living in community for 7 years, we had those tight relationships. But all of a sudden, organically, it's being formed another generation who's been hyped to death. They could care less about the sage on the stage. They want a relationship with people of their like heart, like mind. And so those relational connectivity began to grow. And the Rock 3.0 now is a discipleship model, of which Brandon really has been a champion of that for many years. What's happened is that, as you know, there's going to be a gradual handoff in a relay race. Well, there's a certain space where the baton's got to be passed. And at one point, one person has the entire baton. At another point, another person's grabbing it, has a little bit of the baton. Gradually, they share 50-50. And then it's 70-30, and all of a sudden it's gone. Now, at this point, I have less of the baton than Brandon does. And it's a good thing, because he really has been leading well. It's still 15 months out before I ascend into heaven, and the clouds, they take me up. It's going to be beautiful. But anyway, Brandon has developed a relational team, which is magnificent. Bob as a missional team, which is magnificent. Uncle Mark, Pastor Mark, is the connection team. Ryan is the next generation team. And Aaron is the healing team. So we have leaders, again, on teams that are raising up a generation of relational connection. Bam. And so Susie and I are here wanting to affirm, wanting to applaud. And we don't do it in a flattering way. I don't believe in flattery, but we see clearly what God is doing. And sometimes the generational handoff is with the next generation. Other times God skips a generation because he's doing something grand on a bigger scale that is laying a groundwork that will need 20, 30, 40 years. I began to pastor at 48. So that was after 20 years traveling. Now all of a sudden, this generation, who knows what God's going to do? Come on, somebody. Over the next 20, 40 years. So, Brandon, give Brandon a hand. Amen.
So, Pastor Brandon, I think we would love to hear, in the midst of what God's doing in the church, which is very positive, encouraging, the culture's in chaos. How many would agree? There's a chaos that's going on. What is the hope that you see for the next 20 years in the midst of the chaos of culture?
Yeah, you know, again, just going into that, I love spiritual fathers in my life, like Francis and Bob. And again, this is a multi-generational church. The last thing we want to see is one generation gather on a weekend. We want to see a multi-generational model. Here's the reality. We need spiritual mothers and fathers in the lives of an orphan generation. They may have physical parents, but they don't have spiritual parents. And we need to see this generational model happen that really happened in the first century church. So that gives me hope when we look back at the first century. We often think that the old days were days where immorality didn't exist. The church was birthed in the most immoral culture we've ever seen in human history. When you would walk down the street, you would see people being crucified before you, naked, exposed to the world. You had your natural bank that you would deposit your money in, had temple prostitutes that would worship the God that would protect your money. I mean, that was the world and culture the church was birthed within. So when we look at our modern culture, here's some reality and harsh stats. We are the loneliest, angriest, unhappiest culture in America's history. When sociologists look at us and psychologists look at us, one of the most revealing studies was the UCLA loneliness scale, where they determined that 1/3 of all Americans are not just lonely, but chronically lonely. So 1 out of 3 people you come across, and the definition of chronically lonely was if you had a need, you would have no one to call. No one would show up in your time of need. So when I look at the reality, we've exhausted all of our resources as a culture. We live like princes and kings and princesses at this time. So when you've had everything, there's no wonderment left. You know there has to be something more in life than what you've experienced, and that more is Jesus. And they're looking for a tangible presence and radical encounter with the Lord. So when we go to Whole Foods or Trader Joe's or to the park, we are seeing a generation, all ages, hungry for an encounter with the Lord. And when you bring, just try this. Next time you check out at the grocery store, just look at the person in the eyes and say, hey, you're doing an amazing job. I really believe that there's a gift and skill that God's given you. Watch them come alive. I guarantee 9 out of 10 will not be like, I'm never going to receive that compliment again. They're going to come alive because there's something about the Spirit of God inside of you that touches something greater inside of them, because eternity is written on the hearts of all humankind. And if we could touch that eternity with the eternal life that God's given us, something can change and shift. So I have hope for the future.
Come on. So we are celebrating this morning 20 years of The Rock, but here's what we believe. We believe The Rock is not done. God has another 20 or more years. So we actually have a video that we're going to show to celebrate what God's done, what he's going to do, and then Pastor Brandon is going to cast a vision of what the next 20 years could look like. So why don't you give it up for this amazing team of leaders, and we'll roll that video.
How do we have a quality of soul, a quality of spirit, an inside that no matter what's going on the outside, we don't get rattled?